On Saturday a week ago, thousands of Shiite Muslims marched together in a parade celebrating the Muslim holiday Arbaeen. This holiday translates its title as the 40th day, and it commemorates the martyrdom of a leader named Imam Hussein, who was the third Shiite Imam, or spiritual leader, the grandson of the founder of Islam, Muhammad. Now, what's interesting about this march of thousands of Muslims is that it didn't take place in some Middle Eastern country. It occurred in Dearborn, Michigan. Now, the presentation of this holiday is given as a celebration or a commemoration of Muslims who have died at the hands of the opposition, of infidels. They play on our ignorance of Islamic history to have a march in America which suggests that Muslims are a poor, oppressed minority just striving for human rights in the middle of an oppressive and hateful Christianized culture. The fact of the matter is, Imam Hussein was killed in the year 680 AD in the Battle of Karbala, which was a battle between Muslim factions. A detail that's rarely addressed in the telling of this story is that he was not killed by religious opponents. He was killed by other Muslims in a power struggle in the generation following the death of Muhammad. A struggle that frankly still exists today between Shia and Sunni Muslims. History is not to be bothered, and they don't want to have to actually tell the true story. What's done here is this march in the United States of America was presented as the struggle of Muslims against the unwelcoming hostility of their now host nation. What's disturbing about this is the overt political messaging that is completely historically altered in order to make a point that is not sustainable by the facts. Muslims appear intent on asserting themselves as the rightful possessors of America, which has traditionally been a non-Muslim land. What they do is they present themselves as oppressed minorities, as those who are simply striving to gain a foothold, a standing in the culture, trying to be good citizens. This is played out in Western societies across Europe and the United States. The problem is, none of that is true. Muslims view Muhammad as both a religious leader and a war commander. Therefore, it is inherently difficult to separate politics from worship in this religion. It's not only difficult, it's actually contradictory. When Muslims are not yet a majority in a nation, their messaging frames events like this parade as simply a striving for the achievement of universal principles of justice and civic participation. They just want to belong. They just want to be left alone. And yet, the history of the last 100 years shows us that in every single instance where they gain significant majority influence, they then change the story and seek to seize power and assert the Islamic worldview. This propaganda only works when Westerners live in an atmosphere of ignorance. The march referenced again and again Gaza and the rhetoric of oppression, anti-Semitic slogans and signs. They were calling Gaza the new Karbala, relying heavily on their expectation that you and I don't know the history, and so we can't tell that they're lying to us. It reminds us that ignorance works to the advantage of Islam. Part of the problem in the Western world is that we have operated out of the presuppositions of a Judeo-Christian worldview, which assumes things like religious liberty, the opportunity for the individual to practice the religion of his belief, of his personal belief. The problem is we have failed to acknowledge the fact that Islam is not merely a religious preference, it is a political and military worldview that is set on world domination. So we have to navigate the challenge in the United States of America of allowing the liberty of conscience for Muslims to practice their religion, and yet figure out how to draw a line between the individual practice of their faith and their intentional undermining of constitutional values and principles that have been the foundational bedrock of the American experiment. CAIR, C-A-I-R, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is about to celebrate next week their 31st anniversary. They are doing so by inviting as their keynote speaker to their anniversary celebration dinner a man by the name of Muhammad Khalil. Muhammad Khalil is a Palestinian activist and a former Columbia University student who has been on the outs with the American government because of his radical language of murder and destruction regarding not just Israel as a nation, but individual Jews, his attack on the Christian foundations of the United States, and his association with known terrorist organizations. The Trump administration has been trying to deport him as a man dangerous to our national security. And yet the Council on American Islamic Relations has chosen him to be the keynote speaker to honor him at their 31st anniversary banquet coming up next week. Their invitation to Khalil is a deliberate alignment of their views with this individual who has shown by his actions to clash 100% with American values. By honoring Khalil, CAIR openly endorses ideologies that glorify violence and division, prioritizing an Islamist political agenda over the national unity and security of the United States. Their history should have given us a clue. CAIR was founded by the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization which, interestingly enough, has set itself to advancing Islamist goals under the guise of civil rights advocacy. The Muslim Brotherhood has actually been banned from Muslim nations like Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. The Muslim Brotherhood is not welcome in Muslim nations because it is such a politically destructive organization designed to intentionally undermine the government authorities in those nations. Why is it that Muslim nations recognize the problem with the Muslim Brotherhood, and yet Europe and the United States seem to have conflicting ideas about how we should handle this? CAIR often speaks about the First Amendment as a way to promote their ability to have a say in the public square, and yet their history shows everywhere that they gain an upper hand. They're no longer interested in free speech and public debate. And the failure of American leaders to recognize and scrutinize CAIR's history and their invitation to Khalil to speak at their dinner reflects a broad absence of political realism. Sometimes conservatives criticize this Islamist agenda, and it seems like every time that the conservatives criticize it, progressives, in a kind of knee-jerk reaction, turn around to defend it. This blinds them to the expectations that CAIR is a wolf in sheep's clothing. They promote free speech, they support persecuted minorities, they say all the right things until they're in charge when they began to punish nonconformity and follow the clear instruction of the Quran that Christians and Jews in particular are to be oppressed under an Islamic government. We've seen this in Europe, as we've seen nation after nation in Europe march themselves to the brink of extinction as Europe allows unregulated Muslim immigration to move them closer and closer to full-fledged invasion and takeover by a very un-Judeo-Christian worldview. Quran Surah 9, verse 29 commands that Muslims should fight non-Muslims until they submit in humiliation. Islamic political ideology promotes a worldview at odds with the commitments to individual liberty, religious freedom, and equality, the very things that nations like the United States traditionally have held dear. In nations like Afghanistan and Iran, Muslims have implemented Sharia-based governance, which explicitly and with government support persecutes Christians, Jews, and homosexuals. Everything that they say now that they're not in favor of doing. It is a sham. Do you know that the Quran teaches that Muslims are not supposed to lie to each other, but it is perfectly acceptable to lie to non-Muslims because from Allah's perspective, the non-Muslim has no rights to be considered. We must recognize what's at stake here and not fall victim to a political correctness or a leftist progressivism that fails to see that this is a serious danger to the survival of our nation. What happens is secular leftists, progressives, are so spiritually bent out of shape in their opposition to Christianity that they've chosen a very strange bedfellow, which is Islam, understanding that while homosexuals may hate Christianity because they feel judged, the fact of the matter is it's not Christians throwing homosexuals off of buildings, but in Iran, that's exactly what's happening. Well, Pastor, what about the Bible and all that it has to say about hospitality to the foreigner, about accepting the immigrant? I hear this kind of conversation all the time. I love it when people who don't read the Bible find a few verses that they pull out and they throw into the debate like the Bible has this blanket approach to acceptance of immigrants on whatever status that they choose to have. I get it. Listen to some of these verses. Taken out of context, they sound like they make a real case for no borders, no protection on those who come in, no checking or vetting of those who want to be here. Verses like Exodus 22:21. You shall not wrong a foreigner or oppress him, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Leviticus 19:33 and 34. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 27:19. Cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Now here's the thing. I've said it many times before. You have to understand the Bible doesn't mean what it says. It means what it means. That's why hermeneutics is an important discipline. It is the art and science of biblical interpretation. Verses dissected out of their context can be used to appear to mean lots of different things. But when we understand what the Old Testament teaches about Israel's attitude toward foreigners, there's something that we often miss. That is that while Israel was told to have a love for immigrants because they themselves were refugees fleeing from Egypt in a previous generation, when we go on and look deeper into what the Old Testament teaches, it teaches that those instructions are so that those who try to come to Israel, to be a part of Israel, to worship Israel's God, they're not to be held back because of their racial or cultural differences. That is, don't be racist. That's what those passages mean. but they do not mean have a blanket acceptance of anybody who comes into your nation and chooses to live any way they want to. In fact, what the Bible teaches is that there were 3 requirements for full acceptance into Israelite society. Number 1, you had to abandon the foreign gods of the nation from which you were coming. In other words, you couldn't come to Israel and have full rights unless you came with the expectation that you wanted to be like Israel, worshiping Israel's God. I don't have a problem with Muslims who practice individually their faith. I do have a problem with this idea that you can come to America and you don't have to have at least the intentionality to be American. Religious participation was important in the process of accepting immigrants in Israel. Immigrants could fully participate in all of the public life of Israel if they converted to the worship of Yahweh. The Bible prohibits the intermarriage of Israelites to non-Israelites, and it is not a racial consideration. It is a protection against the damage done when false gods are given a foothold and allowed to coexist side by side with the dominant belief system of a nation. This idea of pluralism works at the level of individuals practicing their conscience beliefs side by side, but pluralism as an organizational structure that says there is no difference between one belief system or another, that is intellectually dishonest. The Bible is very clear. We are to love the immigrants. We are to show hospitality to those who try and come live among us. But the Bible is also very clear that we do that with the expectation that they fully come into the worldview and the value system, the constitutional experiment that is America. What's in process right now is we have politicians so afraid to display any backbone that we have accepted the idea that Muslims can create Sharia law enclaves. Dearborn, Michigan is particularly one of those places where police will not service certain neighborhoods because Muslims have declared that they will engage their own legal systems. That is not a sustainable recipe for the survival of a nation. The Bible has a lot to say about immigrants, but to accept all of them with no standards and no expectation of stepping into the Judeo-Christian worldview that defines America, that is a misuse of Scripture. We've got to recognize that there are wolves among us pretending to be sheep. And if we don't get our minds right, one of these days we'll be the minority group and it will not go well for us. Listen, before I let you go on this episode, just a few minutes before I stepped in front of this camera to record this episode of Truth Currents, I saw the news that Charlie Kirk, a political conservative activist and strong Christian believer, has been shot in an assassination attempt at Utah Valley University. When I started this recording a few minutes ago, the news still wasn't clear about whether he would live or die, whether he will survive the attack or not. I will say that the video footage is graphic and disturbing. Here's what I'd like to say to you. This will not be the last assassination attempt in the near future in this country. The progressive left is mentally unhinged, they are spiritually adrift, and they are politically desperate. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you need to settle the issue of where your loyalty rests and what the answer is to the question. When somebody puts a gun to your head and says, renounce Jesus Christ or meet him, you better know what your answer is going to be. I'm typically not an alarmist. I am an optimist by nature. But I am deeply disturbed by the events of today's stories. And I want you to understand, America may not survive. It may not survive the rest of this generation. That's why it's important for us to remember that we are citizens of a different kingdom, a kingdom that will survive, and the gates of hell itself will not stand against Jesus Christ. If you're on the fence about your faith, you better settle up, because the time to have a foot in both worlds is past. It's gone. You're with Jesus or you're not. Take a stand. This is Truth Currents.